All right, so I've been on this project where I have been considering upgrading my Mac Pro. It's a 2010 5.1. I have it pretty much maxed out. I'm going to list all of the things that I have in the machine. What I'm wondering is because I can't upgrade anything anymore, I'm getting pretty frustrated. And I managed to get Monterey on it, but I can't go any further really. It's the only operating system that handles all my software and the hardware correctly. So a friend of mine, he offered to let me try out this 2018 Mac Mini that he has. And I was curious, like, I don't know, how does that stand up against my Mac Pro, which is pretty maxed out? Then, on top of it, I managed to get a hold of Mac Studio M2 Max. What I do generally is I'm an old school Adobe user. I've been using Photoshop since version 2. Um, I do a lot of music. I've released a couple of CDs. I do some digital music, so I use Logic. I've used it for a really long time. I do a lot of photography, not really high res professional stuff, more like things that interest me. And then I often use those photographs for websites that I'm building. I've used Premiere for a long time, been thinking about going into DaVinci, but haven't done it yet. And I do use Camtasia because I do screen recording with it, and I find it really easy to use to throw things together. So I do a lot of stuff over PowerPoint, a lot of stuff over Zoom. I do some class stuff, so I'm integrating these things together. And I also use InDesign for PDF stuff. I have to be honest, I love having tabs open in Chrome, and I keep Firefox open simultaneously. I'm usually running about 10 tabs in Firefox. Right now, it's really excessive, and I have about 80 tabs open in Chrome. So sue me. It's just how I am. So I like to have things open, especially with Adobe products. The Synergy trading files over from one program to the next. I do this a lot. So I don't like to close things. I like to have things open. So I'm going to test these three systems together with things open if I can. So I ran Sierra for a really long time, super stable. I upgraded to High Sierra, super stable. I ended up using OpenCore Legacy Patcher to get onto Monterey. I'm pretty happy with that, although I've had to do some upgrades with software because I'm in 64-bit land and there's some things that I can't run anymore. So also note that the M4 Mini just came out a couple weeks ago. The same friend who gave me the 2018 Mac Mini works for Apple, would give me a deal. I could get a 32 gigabyte RAM, 1 terabyte machine for about $1,400 with the discount. So it would be a pretty good deal, but I'm like, I don't really want to spend $1,400 if I don't have to. Is my Mac Pro still really worthy of sticking around for another year or two? This is what I want to find out. So my objective is to see if I can ride out the Mac Pro a little bit longer. Should I upgrade to an M series? Should I keep this Studio that I got, because I could turn around and sell it for a profit really easily? I got a great deal on it. So that's what I'm trying to figure out here. So I copied my Monterey system from the Mac Pro over to the Mac Mini, super easy. However, doesn't seem like the M2 Max wants to run Monterey. So I ended up doing a Ventura install and migrating my data over to it so that I could get it to run. So that's really the only difference between the three systems. Now, I also have an external hard drive. It's in a USB enclosure. It's a 4 terabyte SSD, and I'm keeping all of the files that I'm working on, and I'm swapping that particular drive between the different systems. So I'll talk about the read-write speed of that drive on each of the systems as well. So the first comparison I did was just a simple CPU benchmark with Geekbench. You can see right here what this looks like. The Studio obviously totally outshines the other two systems, but interestingly, the multi-core stats are pretty similar between the Pro and the Mini, and we'll come back to that later. Next is the GPU test on Geekbench. You can see actually that the Pro is about half of what the Studio does, and the Mini is dismal at best, and that is going to come back to haunt the rest of the tests that I do, to be honest with you. The next thing we did was the drives. So I used Blackmagic just to give you an idea of how fast these drives are. Now, note, this is the only thing that really bugs me about the Studio, is that it only has a 512 gig drive. There have been some stats out there that say that the 1 terabyte drive performs about 40% better than the 512. I was looking for machines that had a 1 terabyte drive, the Pros basically, whether that's a Mac Mini or the the Studio with a 1 terabyte drive, just because of the performance of the internal drive. I'm not sure, honestly, with my current setup, which is running at about half of what the Studio is CPU wise, if it's really even going to make a difference if I bump up to a 1 terabyte drive and get that extra 3000 megabits per second, because already it's such a huge performance improvement. And compared to the Mini, my Pro, and those two are night and day. So the Studio and the Pro are night and day. I question, is it really necessary for me to try and find a 1 terabyte Studio, which is in my price range, an M1. I couldn't even afford an M2, but I got this M2 right now. So something to keep in mind with what I'm looking at. So you can see also that the SSD, the Fengxiang that I'm using, it performs a little bit differently. It actually is faster on the Mini. I'm using the same ports, and I'm using, because I can't find a C to C adapter, I'm using a C to A adapter, and then using a little dongle so that I can get it into the Thunderbolt port on the Studio and on the Mini. So it's just weird that it's just faster on the Mini for some reason. I'm not even sure why. I think that the Thunderbolt protocol and version on the Studio are so far superior to the Mini, but I can't figure out why it's running slower. If anybody has any ideas, let me know in the comments. Looking at Photoshop, I did this giant graphic file. It's 300 DPI. It's, like a 4K size file essentially. And I was able to record the load times. They're pretty negligible between the different programs. The real test here was with Logic. Now what I did is I built a file on my Pro. I took a previously existing 1.5 gig file that I used, and I copied it, and then I added about 40 plugins to it. My Pro handles it just fine. The Mini, on the other hand, could not. So note, I'm running this Logic file with my 80 tabs in Chrome open and Firefox, and it handles it just fine. Really, no problems. It lags a tiny bit compared to the Studio. The Studio is so peppy. But the Mini, I actually got an error that said disk too slow or system overload. So I had to close Chrome and Firefox just so I could get playback from the Mini. I believe that this is the low GPU that's causing a big amount of the problem. Also, the load time for the file, you can see it took almost a minute to load on the Mini itself, and it loaded in just under 8 seconds on the Studio and just under 16 seconds on the Pro. Also, I did Camtasia 2024. I don't own this particular program. I'm still using an older version. So there is a nag that I was getting to buy the program, but it still loaded the file that I created in Pro in just over 17 seconds. It loaded that same file in 7 seconds in the Studio, and again in the Mini, I had to close Chrome and Firefox. Now, The file is something I just put together really fast. It's basically 4K size video. It's 5 minutes and 26 seconds in length, and I'm running it at 29 frames per second. And there's also an audio file in there that's 44.1 that I composed. And I'm using transitions and filters. It's a 984 megabyte file. It's almost a gig. So it's a pretty big file. I did the export times, and this is really funny. The studio exported this thing in just over 37 seconds. Oh my God. And then the Pro exported it in 6 minutes, and then the Mini in just over 8 minutes. So a huge difference. The last thing I did to try and test the GPU and the CPU at the same time, which is a little bit tricky, is loading up this 4K Amazon video in YouTube at full screen, utilizing QuickTime screen recording, just to see with the combination of the two what kind of performance I would get out of it. Now, I'm not a gamer, so I didn't do any gaming tests, and that's probably what most people would do with the GPU. For me, that's not really a priority. So anyway, I hope this is useful for somebody if you're thinking about using a Mac Mini for anything. Now, I know that the M series chips are completely different, right? They optimized the RAM and the swap space and cache and GPU integration all on the same board, and everyone talks about, you know, the performance benefits of doing that. So this unfortunately is not something that I have in my possession. If I did, I would love to do the comparison, but I'm not going to drop any more money just to get one for this kind of project. So there was one more thing that I almost forgot to mention. It's sound. So being a musician and recording, I do voiceovers and music, and the Mac Pro, which I've had for years, I've always had in a closet. Well, I've moved. I don't have a closet available to put the Mac Pro in, and it can get loud, especially when I'm running Logic and I'm trying to do recording. I can hear the fans whirring. So I tested the Mac Mini and found that I would also need to put it in a closet. It is really loud once those fans kick in. The interesting thing about the Mac Studio is I actually ran some terminal commands to see if I could get the CPU taxed enough to spin the fans up, and I couldn't. And it's sitting right in front of me, and it is just dead silent. And I had seen another Pro Gear guy who did a comparison on the sound, and he used microphones and tested the dB emission from the Mac Studio M2 and a Mac Mini M2, and he definitively said that the Studio was much quieter. So I just proved that this thing is so quiet. It's sitting right on my desk. I don't have to stuff it away anywhere if I want to do microphone recording. So that's a huge bonus. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about power consumption. So really quickly, I did some calculations, and here where I live, northern San Diego County, California, if I just run normal operating procedures with the Mac Pro, not maxing it out with, you know, video and stuff like that, I would pay $106 a year. The Studio would be about $12 a year, and the Mini would be about $8 a year. So go figure. Now, I guess I have to say, what is the bottom line? If you're on a Mac Pro and you've got it maxed out like I do, I think it still has some longevity. I really like my machine, to be honest with you. I would rather not part with it. So I guess the bottom line is, if you could get a Mac Studio for really cheap, then it might be worth it. Now, I've also seen some of the super geeks out there talking about the M1 actually not even being in the same ballpark as the M4 Mini and the M2 Ultra. So if you're doing really high-end video stuff, you probably could go that direction and that would be fine. But if you're in the place where I'm at, Mac Studio M1 or M2 is probably going to be such a huge improvement that that would run you another 5 years. That's what I'm guessing. Also, if you're stuck with the 512 gigabyte hard drive compared to the 1 terabyte hard drive, there are some people out there that are moving their user folder off of the main internal hard drive to an external. So if you get yourself a 1 terabyte NVMe, put it in an enclosure, and run your user profile admin account off of that drive. So you've got your downloads folder, your applications folder, your library folder, your documents folder, your desktop folder, run it off of the external drive, then you're basically bypassing the crippling that Apple did to the 512 gigabyte internal hard drive, which to me is just insane that they did that. If I had a way to punish them by not buying their products, I would, but they still make good computers and they suit my needs, plus they have logic, and I just really like that program. So also running your external hard drive, whether that's an NVMe in an enclosure, 4 terabyte, or if you're running a NAS, or however you want to handle you storing external files, that's something that you need to deal with, because I got my SATA in my Pro at 8 terabytes and it costs nothing, and I could continue to do that, but then I'd be running at 300 megabits per second read-write speeds, compared to what's available out there now, which is like in the 6,000, 7,000 range. I know that it's a bit of money, so that's why I'm holding on to my SSD, and it's 4 terabyte, and I paid 125, 150 bucks for the drive and the enclosure. I do like the Fengshang drives. They're made in China. Everybody likes to go after some of the name brands instead of the more rare Chinese brands, but I've found those drives to be really good. Actually, I've got one in my laptop, it works really well, and I've got one in my external enclosure, it works really well. That's what I did all these tests on. So there you go.